The pontoons surged forward, carried by their own momentum. In a matter of seconds, their crews had guided them into place. Before the astonished Germans and Italians could recover, waves of tanks, guns, and men were coming ashore across the pontoons. The impossible had been accomplished. The next strike was at Salerno, the first blow at the mainland of Europe. This time the Germans knew all about the pontoons and were ready to handle them. The Italian troops guarding the shallow water beaches at Salerno were reinforced by the crack 16th Panzers. Big guns had been installed on the cliffs. Stukas and Focke-Wulfs stood ready at the landing fields. All received the same orders.
When the landing comes, get those verdammt Yankee pontoons.
The minute the German guns opened up, everybody knew this was going to be different from Sicily. But the LSTs still came on. The first men had already hit the beach. Unless support could be gotten to them, they'd never leave it. The pontoons were launched. On the open rafts, the men were as exposed as frogs on a flat rock. Then the Stukas came down on them. The planes concentrated on the LSTs and the loaded causeways. Many of the 300 Seabees riding the pontoons were killed. 42 were awarded the Purple Heart. German bombs and shells wrecked some of the pontoons, but the steel boxes were all interchangeable, and new ones were substituted. The flow of trucks and tanks was never interrupted for more than a few minutes. A Seabee-operated bulldozer had the honor of being the first invasion vehicle to land in Europe. In spite of one of the worst bombardments in history, the Navy and Coast Guard brought in 190 LSTs. They were unloaded. The Germans fell back, and the Salerno beachhead had been taken. The whole world knew the next attack must come against the west coast of Europe, against the Atlantic Wall, one of the greatest engineering projects in history. The Germans had good reason to believe that we could never land a mechanized army against such defenses as these. That would mean landing more supplies here in 2 months without any docking facilities that were landed during the entire First World War with the use of all the Atlantic harbors. Yet, if these fortifications fell, Germany must fall. Plans for the invasion began in 1943 at the Quebec Conference. It was decided that at least 12,000 tons of supplies and 2,500 vehicles per day would have to be landed to support our attacking forces. This was more than all the French ports could have handled even in time of peace. For strategic reasons, the Bay of the Seine was selected for the landing. But the Bay of the Seine has a 21-foot tide. That meant any causeways usable at low tide would be underwater at high. There was also a stiff tidal current that would carry away any ordinary floating bridge. And also there were sandbanks that made shipping almost impossible. The German fortifications were particularly strong here. The conference did not attempt to solve these problems. They simply outlined the broad policy and left the details to the engineers. Immediately, preparations began to launch the invasion, one of the most gigantic operations ever undertaken by man. Enormous bases were built along the south coast of England: Exeter, Plymouth, Dartmouth, Falmouth, Forey, Salcombe, Teignmouth, and many others. But the bases were only incidental to the incredible engineering project underway. While the world waited, work went on in the utmost secrecy throughout the autumn of 43 and the spring of 44. Every day, flights of planes passed over the yards on their way to hammer the Atlantic Wall. Troops were shunted from all parts of England toward the docks. The great transports began to unload at Plymouth and Southampton. Something was getting ready to break.
This program has been interrupted to bring you a news flash. London, the invasion of Europe has begun.
After days of savage fighting, the Germans fell back from the coast. But according to plan, before they retreated, train loads of explosives were driven onto the great wharves at Cherbourg, Le Havre, Brest. Then... in a few minutes, the work of a generation of French architects and engineers was wiped out. The famous pier at Cherbourg, where the Normandy used to dock in peacetime, was ripped apart. The wharves at Le Havre were turned into rubble. It would take months to repair the destruction, if it could ever be repaired. The Germans, thinking our invasion force had been cut off, counterattacked. In Berlin, Goebbels shouted this would be the greatest disaster in British and American history. The German reserves, held in readiness for months, were thrown in. They were told that the invasion force had been cut off from all supplies. Even building a breakwater to protect our cargo ships would take months. The Allies had anticipated the destruction of harbors. So in the month before D-Day, a great fleet had been assembled along the English coast, the strangest fleet that ever put to sea. Giant floating cement blocks, each literally as big as a house, stood ready in the harbors. These blocks, called Phoenixes, were a British innovation. Each had its own specially trained Seabee towing crew. Every Phoenix was divided into compartments equipped with sea valves, so it could be sunk in a few minutes. By sinking 20 or 40 of these blocks end to end, an enormous breakwater would be formed in a few hours. To protect the Phoenixes from attack, each of the cement blocks had a 40-millimeter gun mounted on top, manned by an army crew. Once the Phoenix was sunk, it instantly became not only a part of the breakwater, but also a fort. Towed by tugs, this incredible armada began to cross the channel the morning of D-Day. The towing crew stood by the tow lines constantly. A sudden plunge of the cement mountains could snap the towing cables like twine. No one but a seaman can realize the difficulty of towing these heavy, plunging concrete giants across the choppy channel. When the Phoenixes reached the Normandy beach, there was a heavy sea running. The Navy tugs jockeyed their massive blocks into line. There was constant danger that the blocks would smash into each other. Dive bombers, shore batteries, and surf combined to make the operation interesting. As each Phoenix was swung into position, its crew opened the sea valves. One after another, the great blocks sank to form the giant breakwater that gradually grew out of the sea. And under its lee, the cargo vessels moved in toward the shore. But the Phoenix breakwater was only part of the gigantic Allied plan. In order to handle the hundreds of cargo vessels, the engineers had determined to build a huge artificial harbor, complete with wharves, docks, piers, and anchorages. The Phoenix breakwater formed one side of this harbor. Another fleet, manned by Navy crews, set out from England. A fleet of old ships, no longer considered serviceable, with explosive charges placed in their holds. These ships were maneuvered into a long line, like the Phoenixes. Then, at a signal, the charges were exploded. The ships sank to form an additional breakwater. A wall of ships, enough vessels to form a small merchant fleet, sunk to provide protection for their comrades bringing in supplies. Among them was the HMS Centurion, veteran of the last war and victor at Jutland, now past her prime, but still able in her death to strike again at Germany. It took only 11 days to turn this beach into a complete harbor. Meantime, the LSTs were unloading over the Navy's pontoon causeways. Here, for the first time in combat landing, the pontoon causeways were sunk to provide a more stable landing stage over the vast distance from tidewater to the beach. As the tide rose, the causeways were submerged at their outboard ends, but the exposed inboard sections could still be used. But this was a temporary expedient. The American and English engineers went right on working on more permanent docking facilities. While this was being done, across the channel came a procession of weird objects that would have interested Buck Rogers. These were the new Lobnitz pierheads, invented by the British, each manned by a Seabee towing crew. These pierheads were secured to the ends of the floating causeways. Then the 4 long legs at the corners of the pierhead were lowered until they struck bottom. These legs held the pierhead and the causeway steady, so the ships could be unloaded. To keep the pierhead from being covered at high tide, the platform was arranged so it could be lifted up and down on its legs. When the tide rose, the platform was raised with it. So no matter what the tides, the pierheads were able to operate 24 hours a day. The English, who weren't used to the Navy pontoons, preferred to use bridges mounted on floats, which they called whales. These whales were used to bridge the distance from Lobnitz pierhead to shore. For ships too big to tie up to the Lobnitz pierheads, the Navy men came through with another trick. They put outboard motors on barges made of pontoons and ran them out to the ships. These self-propelled barges, called rhinos, were probably the most useful single invention in the whole operation. During the first days of the invasion, 85% of all vehicular traffic was landed by rhinos. In 2 or 3 trips, a rhino could unload an entire LST, regardless of tide, currents, or enemy gunfire. Having about as much draft as a flounder, the rhinos could run up on the beach and unload. Some were simply beached and used as a sort of a warehouse for men needing sudden supplies. Within a few days after the first men had come ashore, more equipment and supplies were being landed on the beachhead than had ever been landed anywhere at any time in history. No harbor in the world could have handled this amount of shipping. Yet this great system of wharves and docks and breakwaters had been constructed under fire. Suddenly, in the middle of this gigantic operation, storm warnings went up. Weather experts had picked June as a good month for the landing. Unfortunately, the wind and sea hadn't read the weather reports. Before the harbor could be completed, the worst June storm in 20 years hit the coast. The huge concrete phoenixes were thrown about like children's playing blocks. For 3 days, it was impossible to bring ships into the harbor. When the storm had blown itself out, the harbor was a ruin. The causeways were torn up and flung on the beach. Scores of ships lay wrecked in the harbor. Immediately, repair operations were begun. On their repair barge, Can Do, which had seen service from H hours, Seabees worked steadily to repair and rebuild wrecked equipment. More supplies were landed in the first month, in spite of the storm, that had been considered possible under ideal conditions. The Seabees stayed to see the Allied armies they had helped land on the beach at Normandy drive deep into Germany itself. They saw guns, trucks, ammunition,